Well, hello again, and welcome back to this week's high-impact principle tip, the first failure of change: no clear definitions. Today, we'll talk about how to clearly communicate feedback from classroom observations so teachers can self-monitor their practice and really dig into the change process. Let's start with this question. Do you eat healthy food? It might seem simple at first, but the answer to that question may very well depend on who you ask. Let's think about it a different way. Welcome to my son's room. If I was to ask, Afton, did you clean your room? He might think for a moment and say, Yeah, Dad. Only for me to walk in a few minutes later and have a very different opinion. And in both of these examples, whether trying to get someone to eat healthier or trying to get my son to clean his room, the change process would be slowed due to the frustration of miscommunication. So let's talk about how to dig, a 3-step process that uses objectively observable and agreed upon behaviors to clarify communication and accelerate teacher growth. Looking back at the first example, if I was to ask, what percentage of your diet is protein? We could begin by objectively measuring a quantity and immediately begin the process of agreeing upon a targeted goal. And as for my son, a question like, Afton, how many items aren't in their spots? Maybe a question he doesn't want to hear, but more times than not, it gets him back in his room, fixing what he forgot before I get the chance to get in there. Moving to the classroom, what types of questions and specific feedback provide teachers objective and observable information that helps them self-monitor their progress and accelerate their growth? So let's look at what not to do. Some feedback, though intended to help teachers improve their practice, is subjective in nature. This subjective correction starts with questions like, is the lesson rigorous? And ends up with feedback along the lines of, the lesson lacked rigor or depth of questioning. How can we focus on probative questions that will get students to think more deeply and inspire inquiry? Feedback like this, though well-intentioned, often leads to frustration among teachers because it can't be immediately implemented. It also can't be measured between observations for teachers to self-monitor their own growth. Another ineffective form of subjective feedback often focuses on positive teacher practices or improvements that have been made over time. Observations focused on subjective improvement begin with questions like, are students responding at a high level, resulting in feedback such as, the students' responses are awesome. It's really impressive how deep they're thinking. How can we focus on getting students to work at this level more often? And again, though well-intentioned, feedback like this reduces the urgency for change and slows the process of growth by endorsing current practices. It also, like all subjective feedback, lacks a measurable goal for teachers to use to self-monitor between observations. Instead, feedback that is objectively measurable and clearly defines ways teachers can improve their practice accelerate the change process. Instead, asking, how many follow-up questions were asked after the initial response, yields feedback like, you didn't ask any follow-up questions when an initial answer was correct. What would be a why do or a how would question that we could ask students after their correct responses? This type of feedback not only feels supportive because we're troubleshooting actual teacher skills, but it provides clear and actionable steps for teachers to take immediately. This can also be generalized into other lessons between observations, and teachers can self-monitor the number of times they ask follow-up questions. It is also possible to use objective, observable feedback in order to focus on positive teacher skills and improvements that they've made over time. This type of feedback asks, how many student responses were in complete sentences and contained academic nouns from the objective? It gives feedback like, when your questions began with why do or how would, the student responses utilized more academic vocabulary. When could you ask more questions like these during other parts of the lesson? This type of feedback not only builds confidence connected to a targeted teacher skill, but it also connects specific teacher behaviors with student success. Teachers can also measure and self-monitor their progress between observations. So remember, if you want to communicate objective and clearly defined feedback, first, list the observable or audible behaviors that are present during a lesson that either advance or impede student learning. Then, try to describe in detail the desired behavior. What would it look like? What would it sound like? Third, describe the differences between the behaviors that are currently being observed in the classroom with those behaviors that are desired to improve student learning. Then ask a question that measures how often the currently observed behaviors are occurring and set a goal for how often a more effective behavior is expected. If you'd like to learn more, come back next week where we talk more about digging into the change process. We'll look specifically at how to intervene with real-time feedback that immediately improves teacher skills and builds independent expertise. And if you believe, like us, that the time is now to improve teacher performance and increase student achievement, contact us today about our teacher performance partnerships. For more information on this tip and many more, click on the link in the description or visit our website at www.clarkconsultingandtraining.com.